Okay.
Right. Good evening. For those that don't know me, my name is Adrian Parsons. I'm a retired police officer as of October 2 years ago, and I've started up on my own as an independent drug expert, along with a couple of colleagues who we shall introduce over the next few weeks. This evening, I'm going to spend the next 30 minutes talking to the wonderful Dave Crosland. Dave, could you just do a brief introduction about yourself, please?
Okay, so I go by the definition of an image and performance enhancing drug specialist, but I do work as an expert witness. I'm the chairman of the Public Expert Advisory Board for ASUK. ASUK oversee all steroid research in the UK. That's linked to Leeds, Manchester, Liverpool, and Birmingham universities, which is overseen by Professor Jim McVeigh. I've provided evidence for the ACMD on steroids. I've spoken at both national and international conferences. Obviously, I do work in the courts as an expert witness. I do both defense and prosecution. I don't specialize in either. And I was I don't know how you say, I used to deliver content for the Kent Police drug expert witness course, and I've done various continual professional development days for both Merseyside, Birmingham, Derby, up there, Durham, I couldn't think of the name, police forces. I run a harm reduction company based around steroid use, and I run a blood testing company that specializes in anabolic steroid users.
Okay, thanks for that. Just so if anyone does want to get in touch with you, Dave, at a later date, what's your sort of, have you got a website that you maintain in respect of your business?
That website is currently offline and being rebuilt, but your best bet is to email me, which is Dave@Croslands, which is Charlie Romeo Oscar Sierra Lima Alpha November Delta Sierra .org.uk.
Right, thank you for that. Super. Dave, so obviously people watching this, I think one of the issues, certainly from my past within law enforcement, is there's lots of misunderstanding about the legal status of steroids within the UK around personal use, consumption, potential importation. Can you clear up for us what is the legal implications or legal status of steroids in the UK?
Right. So there's the main consideration. Most steroids in the UK are what's known as UGL, underground lab. So they're not a pharmaceutical product. They're made by an underground laboratory using raws from China. Possession of anabolics is perfectly legal as long as it is for personal use. There is no guideline of personal use, and it isn't as clear set as X amount is personal and X amount is potential sale, because type of drugs falls into this, number of different compounds falls into this, because steroids come in various formats and variations. It is legal to import them in the sense that bring them in on your own person. So I can legitimately go to Egypt, buy steroids over the counter in a pharmacy over there, and bring them back through customs. I am required to declare them, and I am required to declare duty on them. And then the same problem arises there. It would be up to Border Force to decide whether the amount I was carrying was deemed as personal use or as a supply amount, and then for further investigation. You cannot, though, import them via the post. That was a change in legislation. I think it's 2012.
Right.
But yeah, there's this, and the supply and manufacture or importation of the raw ingredients is all illegal. And by supply, it is the passing of the drug from one person to another. There is no sale needs to take place. There's no exchange of finances or favors or anything of that nature. Literally giving somebody steroids would be classed as supply. But other than that, I mean, this is where it gets confusing, because, like I said, possession and use is perfectly legal. There's no criminal offense committed there. It is only the supply chain that is the offensive sort of element of it.
Okay. Certainly in relation to steroids, Am I right in assuming that the majority of steroids, if they're not produced in the UK, are destined what come from China? Is that fair to say?
So the raw ingredients generally come from China. The finished products tend to come from Europe. There is a big black market industry in counterfeit steroids. They aren't there because they're trying to con steroid users out of their hard-earned cash. They're there because they're trying to con hospitals out of their hard-earned cash. The issue is that once steroids, any sort of hormone drug, enters the supply chain, it becomes very controlled. But it's very easy for pallets and boxes of counterfeit drugs to be sideswiped before they enter the supply chain and then hit the black market and get sold to steroid users. But their target is not steroid users. Their target is really pharmaceutical supply chains. Now, there is a little bit of a weird law loop, actually, which I should cover. Prescription law would make it an offense for someone to hold a prescription drug. But a prescription drug is specified by type and brand, not by generic term. So whereas if I had a vial of testosterone that was made in Uzbekistan, I'm not holding a prescription drug as recognized by this country. I'm not committing an offense. But if I was holding a vial of Sustanon that's used in TRT over in the UK, then technically I do commit an offense because I've got a prescription drug without a prescription valid for it. But I've never seen that avenue prosecuted because I think the basic outcome is that the offense is just not serious enough to warrant any time and effort into it. But there is technically a little bit of a loophole there that if someone is holding prescription grade steroids, that they are committing an offense because they don't have a prescription to cover them.
Do you think do you see there's much sort of cross contamination between the steroid market in the UK and what I, as an ex police officer, call the illicit market? So your cocaines and your stimulant drugs within the illicit side. Is there much sort of crossover?
No, generally they seem to keep themselves very separate, and organized crime, in the most part, not entirety, but in the most part, seem to have stayed away from steroids, which is surprising because there is a big market there. What you will see is more stuff like sleepers, diazepam, those sort of drugs you'll see in the steroid supply market, which is probably a drug that will span both areas of supply a little bit more. I have known steroid suppliers move into cocaine supply and stuff like that, but generally speaking, they stay in their lane. The market for steroids is very different. It's much more like a mainstream product market. So products are sold on brand, they're sold on reputation. That there isn't the where you get to say, for argument, like cocaine. You'd buy cocaine or ecstasy in a nightclub. You wouldn't know the dealer. You'd probably never see him again. There is that sort of festival environment of stuff. You don't get that with steroids. There's a seller-buyer relationship, much more on the line, I suppose, with heroin users.
Right.
Whether there's a developmental relationship of a customer and a sales that develops between the steroid supplier and his customer base.
Okay. How big do you think, in your opinion, is the UGL industry in the UK?
Massive.
Really?
It's hard to quantify. Last time, and I have to be honest, I haven't had a in-depth look at the number of operating labs at the moment, but the last time I looked, we were somewhere around the 300 to 400 commercially viable UGLs operating in the UK. Now, to give you an example of how big these labs can be, one of the most recognized labs to ever be busted, for want of a better terminology, was Alpha Pharma. Now, Alpha Pharma was run by a Dutch guy. They were based in India, and they were effectively a pharmaceutical company, but with no licenses. So the level of equipment they had, the way they prepared their products, was just like any other pharmaceutical company that produces hormones. It's just they weren't licensed to do it. I think the total in about a 10-year period was 24 tons of steroids they imported into the UK.
Okay. From one
It was
through one
something.
lab.
It was something insane. And when you think that the average vial of steroids weighs somewhere around 15 to 20 grams, it sort of gives you an idea of how much volume that is. You know, it's not unusual to see a single supplier with an annual turnover in the 100,000s. Labs can comfortably be turning a profit of 5,000 plus a week without much effort. So yeah, it's big business. We're definitely talking millions upon millions. Whether it would strike into a billion, I wouldn't like to go that far, but we're definitely talking high figure millions. It is a big market, and it's growing. And this is where it's different to recreational drug use. So with recreational drug use, you get peak periods, usually relatable around somebody's age.
Okay.
So you'll see a peak in cocaine use and ecstasy use sort of 17, 18 up to sort of late 20s. Then social status changes, relationships get serious, families come along, and that use starts to decline then when in that age group. You'll get a few that still do it, but it's more special occasions. It's not every weekend warriors. And there'll always be exceptions to that, but that's the general basis of it. The problem with steroids is that most steroid users never stop using.
Okay.
So
For
they
what
may
reason?
they're usually because they damage their hormone systems to the point where they become dependent on the drug, not from an addiction point of view, but they need it medically. So as a result, if I'm a steroid user, I've used steroids and my endocrine system no longer works properly, so I need testosterone replacement therapy. Do I go to the NHS and jump through a load of hoops? Do I go private and spend £200 a month? Or do I buy a bottle of gear off my supplier and inject it myself because I know where to get it from and I know what I'm doing? To an extent, most don't run it correctly. And so as a result, you get this drop in dose where they may not be cyclitic anymore, but they still continue to use and they still continue to buy from the black market.
Okay. I mean,
So it's an ever expanding marketplace. That's the difference of it. It is just constantly growing.
Right. How many main UGLs would you say? I mean, a number of main UGLs in the UK. Are there sort of 4 or 5 predominant ones, or are there lots of little labs scattered around the UK? Or
there's probably about 300 to 400 commercially viable labs. So they are producing steroids on a level that is commercial, i.e., it's not just a bloke and a few mates.
Right.
Those that are actually doing it where you would class it as a substantial business, I'd probably say somewhere between 50 to 100. You'll get little pockets of little local labs that provide to, say, 50 to 100 customers. But, I mean, there's labs now that not only sell UK, but sell broader Europe, sell into America, sell into Australia. UK is the capital in the world for the manufacture of finished steroid product. All the raws, well, 95% of the raw powder comes from China.
Right.
So the raw ingredients come from China, but the UK is the center of making those raw ingredients into a usable product. And we're even listed as a country of concern in like Australia and America for the export of steroids to those countries.
So we're buying the raw powders from China. They're coming into the UK. They're being blended and mixed to the UK and exported out.
Yeah, it's big business, and it's quite, in a way, it's quite odd because you'll have a lab, say, that's based in Glasgow, selling to a guy in London, and then you'll have a guy in London where there's a lab literally 2 streets away selling to somebody else in Glasgow. There's no, it's not geographically based. So steroids originally used to be point of person sale. You know, you'd go see your local steroid dealer and buy your drugs. That's all gone with social media now, and the vast majority of steroid sales are done through some form of electronic communication. WhatsApp is incredibly popular, like it is with all drug sales.
Yeah.
And the network spread the entire country and even the globe to some extent. Steroid users or steroid suppliers tend to be fairly sloppy. You
What, in respect to
don't
covering
get,
the tracks or
yeah, you
what?
don't get encrypted phones. They do stupid stuff like run all the money through their personal bank accounts and all sorts of daft stuff like this
Yeah,
that you would never see. So generally, when you stumble across a steroid supply case or a lab, there's usually a whole host of evidence if you know where to look.
yeah.
It's just a case of looking. Because, like I said, generally they're not very careful. It's been long regarded within supply chains that generally steroids are considered a lesser drug by the police, lesser interest, and the police don't really know what to do with it.
Mm.
So, I mean, I police officers admitted to me that they've had steroid jobs and they just keep putting them to the bottom of the bloody pile because they
Yeah.
just do not want to look at it because it's full of all these chemical names that they don't understand.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, that's yeah, I support that totally. And it's a minefield for police because they just don't have the experience or the knowledge to take those jobs
Uh,
forward. And yeah, no,
the
totally
other
see
thing
why.
is because they don't have the knowledge, when they do a report, those reports tend to be not the strongest factually.
Mm.
And then it obviously makes them very exposed to cross-examination and to criticism in court that the report's not particularly robust, particularly around valuations. And it makes officers nervous. I mean, I don't want to put my neck on a line for a job that I really don't know what I'm doing with.
Yeah, yeah.
And the other thing is, up until more recently, courts have always been a little bit, I think they've been a little bit lost with the sentencing as well. And they've always tended to be a little bit on the lenient side.
Mm.
That seems to be changing now. We're starting to see guys getting sentences 4 or 5 years for steroid supply, where previously those same offences would have probably got a slap on the wrist and a non-custodial and bound over for 12 months or whatever.
Why do you think that
So
is then? Why do you think the court's getting stricter?
I think the courts are starting to see the value.
Right.
So they're looking at sentencing more based around the financial value of the business that's involved around the supply of the drugs. And whereas previously the drugs have never been valued very well, because there is so much internet content now, though it may be a little bit on the high side, an officer can still get valuations online and have some indication of where they are. And I think across the board, everyone's starting to wake up to the fact that this is actually quite a big business and there's a lot of money changing hands here.
Do you think the police are waking up to it as well, or is it still
A little
catch up?
bit, but I think it's a bit of it's a mixed bag. Those that have enough confidence to tackle it are keen to go for it because they see big financial elements to it. But there's still a lot of officers that are very scared around committing to a steroid case because, they, like you say, to them it's just a load of big, complicated words that they don't understand.
Mm. And also, I suppose it's from a police perspective, it's priorities, and your average steroid user doesn't come to the attention of the police, so it's under the radar, and it's not something the police are really interested in.
Well, the other thing is, what's the social impact?
Yeah,
there isn't one. You've not
right.
got steroid users mugging old grannies to feed the rabbit or breaking into the local shop. So you've got no local constabulary pressure from a residential point of view because they're not bothered about the steroid dealer because he's not stood on a street corner. He's not causing problems. The users aren't collapsed behind a wall, or acting idiots in town. You don't get any of that. It's all done very privately and very quietly, and everybody just gets on with it. So as a result, no social impact, no social pressure to deal with the problem. So why? I've got more important things like ecstasy dealers and heroin dealers and cocaine dealers that I need to deal with, and I know what they are, and I've got a social reward for dealing with them. It looks better from stats and figures point of view for the force. Everything is beneficial to me by dealing with those cases. Where I look at a steroid case and I might get a decent poker out of it, but everything else is just a headache.
Yeah, I think that's right, and it's. I mean, you look at the harms of steroids, as you say, they're not mugging old grannies, and seemingly the only real harm is potentially to the user if they're not used correctly.
Yeah, and that is woefully misunderstood. There's nowhere near the awareness around steroid harms to users as there should be, because steroid users don't confide in the National Health Service when they've got problems. They confide in somebody like me.
Yeah. Dave, I'm aware of the time. Just got one more question. I'm aware. Obviously, we've known each other for probably well over 10 years, maybe even 15 years, when we first met at a conference in Merseyside. And I've listened to you talk many, many times, and I would never ever enter into the world of steroids or pieheads or iPads, whatever they want to be called these days. But I know that you do a fair bit of work around harm reduction in prisons. What's all that about?
Yeah, so I do not as much as I used to because of unfortunate red tape, but
Right.
we've got to a stage now where if you're not accredited with this, that, and the other, they don't want you doing things. And the thing is,
Mm.
there's no accreditation with what I do, so I
Okay.
can't get accredited. But yeah, so I deliver a couple of presentations. The main one is actually to the inmates about the effects of steroids and how the prison environment is an ineffective environment to be using, despite what they may want to do. A lot of guys go into prison want to come out jacked. They've got
Mm.
access to a gym. They've got nothing else going on. But they don't realize the consequences of a hormonal shutdown and everything that can lead from that. So there's an education element to there as well. And then the backside of that is teaching staff not only from a point of view of what to look for from a discovery point of view of drugs within the prison or discovery of use within the prison,
Yeah.
but also what to look for from a point of view of users having problems post-use. So very, very briefly, because I know time's of the
Mm.
essence, when you
Yeah.
take steroids, your natural hormones stop working.
Yeah.
There's no guarantee they'll start again afterwards. The result of extremely low hormones, particularly in a male, is depression.
Mm.
A chemical depression plus a prison environment is not a good mix. So
Right.
we have a risk of self-harm coming there. So it's also about educating staff to, what to look for in changes in personalities or behaviors and things like that, so that they can sort of get an edge on if somebody is going to have problems. They've done a cycle and they're going to crash hard post cycle and end up with issues.
Mm.
But
So,
the
so
other,
what? Go on.
as
Carry
I
on, mate.
said,
Sorry.
the other issue around prison work is obviously cleanliness of administration of the drug.
Right.
Needles are easy to come by. They tend to get used, resharpened, or reused, which is obviously a very poor environment. So the prison environment is probably the only environment where bloodborne viruses actually become a concern for a steroid user, because outside of the prison environment, it just doesn't happen. Ejection equipment is cheap and easy to get hold of, so nobody bothers sharing or borrowing or anything stupid like that. But in a prison environment where you've got limited access to injection equipment, there is then more of a risk of needle sharing.
Okay. Final question, I promise. So, what would you say in relation to people that say, well, Dave, okay, you're going into prisons talking about harm reduction to the users, but they shouldn't have drugs in prison. So, what would you be your response to that? Surely they may say, well, you're condoning steroid use in prisons, and actually having a drug in a prison, be it personal, is illegal. So,
Let's
what's your
let
stance?
let's not be naive about this. They're not
Mm.
supposed to have mobile phones in prison. They're not supposed to have Subutex in prison. They're not supposed to have a lot of things. The reality of this shit happens.
Yeah.
And though a lot of, well, so that's probably the wrong way of putting this. Okay. There are prisons that would rather turn a blind eye and not look at the problem because they don't want to have another bad stat on their list of drugs inside.
Mm.
But the result is, if someone is messing themselves up hormonally, does end up with severe depression, and does end up swinging from the chandelier,
Mm.
that's a far bigger problem for the prison to deal with than dealing with the drug education in the first place.
Yeah.
Carrot workers already deal with the addictions around heroin and cocaine use and other recreational drugs.
Yeah.
There is evidence emerging that steroids are addictive in the classical sense, but what is without doubt true, there is a very strong dependency towards steroid use. Both psychological and physical, because of the hormone imbalances, and psychological because people start to value themselves based on their visual appearance. And a loss of that visual appearance means a loss of their self-worth. And so as a result, they're driven to stay on steroids to maintain a physique. So in their head, they maintain being of somebody of worth. So, you know, let's be realistic. We don't live in
Mm.
an ideal world. Shit happens.
Yeah,
And at the end of the day, to say there's no drugs in prison, I don't think anybody of half a brain cell is ever going to declare there's no drugs in prisons.
no.
I mean, there's a job going at the moment for one of the officers at Liverpool, bringing in a duffel bag full into Liverpool.
Yeah,
You know, so it happens. There's no denying it.
as you say, it's big money, isn't it?
It is. And the thing is, if you can't control the supply, the other approach to that is educate the user so they don't need the supply.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't go in with a don't use steroid approach. It's a stupid, ridiculous approach that doesn't work. What I go in with is this is a shitty environment to do it in. You can't get decent food. You can't get decent gym access. Why waste the money and the time on drugs that will serve you much better once you're released? It's probably not the ideal for a lot of people because it's not a cessation approach, but it's not about stopping people using it. It's about keeping people safe. There is a difference.
Yeah, no, totally agree with that.
You know, once we get them safe, then we can look at maybe educating them in a different way. But first thing is keep them safe.
Yeah, no, spot on. Dave, thanks for that. I really appreciate your time. I know you are exceptionally busy. You're the busiest person I know. Really appreciate your time. Hopefully, people that watch this will have a bit of an eye opening just from some of the things that you said. So I hope this goes down well. I hope people enjoy it. And Dave, once again, thanks very much. Really appreciate your time.
My
Thanks,
pleasure, mate. Anytime, you know that.
Cheers. Thank
No
you.
problem.